Chances are, if you're interested in watches, you're at least vaguely familiar with vintage watches. At some point in your collecting journey, the allure is strong, a definite siren on the shore. Vintage terminology gets thrown around a lot nowadays, and everyone has slightly different definitions as to what constitutes a true vintage watch, but general consensus usually falls somewhere around 25 years or older. Buying a vintage watch naturally comes with more risk than a brand new, or at least new to you, modern watch. Potentially costly mechanical issues chief among them if you don't do your due diligence before a purchase, or take a blind risk off eBay. So today, we're going to offer you a compromise: vintage reissues. Watch designs that have been resurrected or revived from decades past in the same form as they once were, but by definition, brand new, and most importantly, with new, fresh, and more reliable calibers. You get the look of a vintage watch as it was, with minor tweaks here and there, with the reliability of a newly manufactured one. And that's a really enticing prospect for a lot of folks, us included. So let's jump right in with our first vintage reissue from Timex, who has been no stranger to breathing new life into old models. And just a very quick note before we do so, for this entire guide, as well as most of our other watch guides, our wearer's wrist maintains a size just shy of 8 inches for context. Alright, now let's get to it. Vintage reissues, by definition, have to have existed more than 25 years ago. So inherently, that disqualifies any new watchmakers and a lot of microbrands. Reissues are going to come mainly from heritage brands who have extensive back catalogs of past references to pull from and revive. That's kind of stating the obvious, but one such manufacturer is Timex, who have dozens of possible candidates and have already done so for a good number of them. One of the most recent Timex reissues is the 37mm Q Timex 1975 Enigma reissue, aka the Mystery Dial. 75 is pushing toward the end of America's space age, but the 1975 Enigma definitely speaks to the design MO of the time. Really quirky, really funky, and a ton of fun. You might even throw in some Bauhaus inspiration as well. The 37mm Enigma uses a central dial match circle in an effort to hide the hands and make them float when viewed from the top. And obviously the rest of the dial is extremely stripped back. No markers except for a really thin minute track on the periphery, an unframed day date at the 2, and most notably the bright red lollipop seconds. Backing up just a second, the tonneau case itself comes highly polished all around, contrasting the finish of the brushed stainless steel bracelet. Also, just about 12mm thick, accounting for the domed acrylic. Speaking of, acrylic is generally considered the softest choice to protect the dial. Timex's old and new will come with acrylic crystals, and with the Enigma, we did notice it scratched incredibly easy as a result. Its inherent softness is actually just as much a strength, however, as you'll be able to take some polywatch acrylic polish and buff any light damage out from time to time without a ton of effort. By the way, Timex hasn't been the only watchmaker to use a floating hands or a mystery dial scheme. Zodiac also threw their hat in the ring with the unique astrographic. Longines sold the Comet, which also comes to mind with a similar approach, as does JLC with the 182. For the price, the flat single-linked brush bracelet is quite notable and markedly retro, especially since it concludes with an old-school fold-over snap clasp without any push buttons. The clasp also provides a healthy serving of 6 micro-adjustments to really help dial in the perfect fit. Safe to say, for just about $200, this is probably the most budget-friendly space-age vintage-inspired watch currently up for sale, and we just think it's a ton of fun. Seiko, just like fellow Japanese watchmaker Casio, has been consistently re-releasing vintage designs. It's a great position to be in. There's an obvious demand for vintage watches, and what better way to meet that demand than to reissue the very vintage watches folks are looking for on the secondary market, only now backed up with more reliable, easily serviceable modern movements. So how did Seiko do with this one? The SRPK-17 in particular, right alongside other SRPK models like the 09, the 11, and 13, feel about as retro as you can get at first glance. Now, there have been very few changes. The only obvious differences from the outside is the dial text above the 6, and the tiny smiling text also above the 6 to denote the updated 4R36 automatic caliber powering the 17. Other than that, everything else is a detailed recreation. Case shape and size, the case's finishes, the grip of the bezel itself, the entire dial presentation, and even the single row flat link steel bracelet. Before its release of this year, an eBay or say Chrono 24 find of the 60s original could have easily cost you 2 to 3 times more the current retail of the SRPK-17, which you can find on sale in a few spots now for just a touch over $300, and full MSRP directly from Seiko will currently cost about $415. If you're okay with not being a vintage diehard, picking up the 17 will ensure the reliability of its caliber at a budget price point most will be able to stomach. Seiko opted for the 4R36, a close variant of the NH36, but a Seiko-only creation that's not offered to any of their partners. It provides roughly 40 hours of power reserve, moderate accuracy with a 3 Hz beat rate, and is utilized in a slew of other Seiko models in different families. Seiko doesn't provide a view, and instead opted for a rugged stainless steel case bag which will let you know which specific edition you have out of the 15,555 limited production run. And yes, Seiko does technically call that a limited edition. On the wrist, we love the wearing experience, 39.5mm across the case, a hyper compact 43.1mm lug to lug, and a 12.5mm thickness, a lot of which you can attribute to the flat bidirectional tension bezel. Plus the flat single link stainless steel bracelet here is a showstopper, and only further adds to the immense character of the main case. Next up, a space-age cult classic reissue from Hamilton, the PSR. The PSR is modeled after the Hamilton Pulsar, the world's first digital watch with an LED backlight, recently reissued as the abbreviated PSR, and a form factor almost exactly like the 70s original. Seiko eventually bought the Pulsar name from Hamilton, and truth be told, the Pulsar had a very short life anyway. With all the recent reissues, Hamilton decided to take another look at the digital statement watch, and it made a few internal changes while keeping the styling as it was, when legends like Keith Richards, Jack Nicholson, and Elton John, to name a few, proudly wore the Pulsar as pop culture tastemakers. If you're not familiar with the original Pulsar, let's walk you through the styling of the PSR reissue. The watch uses a very simple 40.8mm by 34.7mm steel case, with a pseudo end link that's meant to look the part but is just part of the main case. Guess you could call the pair pseudo lugs, a 3 o'clock button to adjust the time and light up the LCD, the screen itself with a box sapphire and Hamilton text in the lower right. Very few changes were made here to the externals, which is great. The only visible change here is the Hamilton text instead of the Pulsar text. We do wish that Hamilton instead used something like PSR in the lower right to stick to the ethos of the original, but the Hamilton sans serif typeface is pleasing and it fits the overall futuristic bill, so not a huge complaint. Hamilton did update the star of the show with improved tech. Instead of a rudimentary LED, the screen is now an LCD and OLED hybrid display. This is an important change, especially for a battery-powered watch. LEDs are pretty power-hungry, and if you want your display to stay on without any sort of solar power gathering ability to constantly offset the consumption, battery life would certainly suffer. In order to solve this, Hamilton keeps the screen in a low-power, darker mode via an LCD, and then the button activates a much brighter and more saturated OLED display that stays on for about 6 seconds before reverting back to the dimmer LCD. As such, the battery life rating is extremely solid at 5 years with normal use of the OLED. To adjust the time, you're going to simply press and hold the button, which will allow you to toggle through the numerals the same way as you would a bedside alarm clock. One of our favorite parts of the PSR, digital display aside, is the 3-link bracelet. Just take a look at the rounded links and the slight taper toward the butterfly clasp. It's visibly unique, and the stellar execution of the case's finishes carry over just as well here. The only thing that would have made it near perfect would have been using screw pins with every link, not just the end link. Bulova maintains American manufacturing history that reaches all the way back to 1875. It's now under the Citizen Watch Company umbrella, but seeing as they have nearly 150 years of history, they have a huge opportunity to pull from back catalog watches for new revivals, which they've already done with the Bulova MIL-SHIPS, a watch that never actually made it to commercial production at the time. In layman's, it was a prototype pieced together for the United States Navy during the 50s. Bulova added the MIL-SHIPS to their archive series in 2021, which also houses heavyweights like the Lunar Pilot Apollo 15 Moonwatch, Digital LED Computron, and Oceanographer Diver. 3 more vintage reissues if you're a fan of the brand and would like to explore this category even further. The MIL-SHIPS is technically a piece inspired by the units made for the US Navy, but it's as close as you can get to a legit reissue of these mil-spec pieces. 41mm across the case, lug to lug hovering right around 50mm even, and about 15mm in thickness. You might notice something about the proportions that is a bit odd to the eye, but perhaps is hard to narrow down? Well, the lug width is 16mm. The case has to narrow down quite rapidly at the lugs, coming to a more noticeable point than a normal 18 or even more common 20mm. Gives it just a bit of an atypical wearing experience. Looking at the watch from the side, you'll notice a sizable dome of the crystal, which certainly evokes divers of yesteryear, a build characteristic that's certainly prevalent in vintage reissues, and we're glad they included one here. Under the crystal is a dial outfitted with what one could argue is faux patina for the loomed markers, and a railroad-style handset also filled with the same off-white loom. The bezel's markers are color-matched, and it does lend some warmth to the viewing experience we're really not all that mad about. So we know you're wondering, this dual-colored strip below the handset is a water ingress indicator. Should any water penetrate the case, the strip of paper will actually change color to let you know if any amount of moisture found its way inside. It's a cool addition, but unfortunately if that much water has already made its way inside at that point, you're going to need service anyway, and there's not much you can do about it. So the MIL-SHIPS is definitely a vintage reissue that you'd pick up for story and style, and we'd say a bit less so because of the movement. The Miyota 82S0 isn't bad per se. It's certainly mechanically sound and well known, but it only offers a 3Hz beat rate and up to 42 hours of power on a full wind, which aren't record-breaking specs by any stretch. And Bulova outfits the MIL-SHIPS with a navy color NATO, again 16mm in diameter with fairly standard pin buckle hardware. But it is made from nylon, and since the main case maintains 200 meters of water resistance, would certainly be a fitting choice for the water. Up next, the Zodiac Super Seawolf Compression Diver. Lesser known to the general public than other household names released alongside this diver circa 1953 like the Rolex Sub and Blancpain 50 Fathoms, the Zodiac Super Seawolf Compression is an incredible value with a similar history as these other horological icons, and still uses a form factor quite faithful to the originals, albeit with new, fresh dial colors. Before we get into the weeds about this newly released green dial version, there are a few Seawolf families that you should know about that use the Seawolf name. The Seawolf Skin Divers, the Seawolf GMTs, and the Seawolf Compression series, which sports this specific styling you see today, of which there are a handful of colors, strap options, and case materials. Anyway, 40mm across a stainless steel case, roughly 47mm lug to lug, and about 13mm thick. This combination does produce an excellent wearing experience for a modern dive watch, vintage inspiration aside. Even for a small wrist, we'd maintain that the Seawolf Compression should be a highly wearable choice for most everyone. Did you know that the Seawolf was actually the first dive watch to use a bezel with 15-minute markers? Well, now you do. This one in particular uses an aqua blue insert with a stainless steel frame and light green markers. The case comes with proper dive utility as well, despite its heavily vintage flair, with 200 meters or 660 feet of water resistance, protected with a screw-down crown on the right flank that looks great proportionally, but is just a touch hard to grip and screw down. Under sapphire, with just a hair of curve, Zodiac uses an analogous green scheme. Bright green for a peripheral chapter, the obvious dark inner green circle housing the raised and loomed rectangular hour markers, the elegant white script and polished logo above the handset, plus a green frame date at the 3. Even though initial Seawolves famously used a sharp Dauphine handset, we saw them start to square off by the late 60s through the 70s. And while we're on the handset, now would be a good time to talk about the new STP-121 caliber, which Zodiac has employed over the older STP-111. It offers a 4Hz beat rate, you may have been able to ascertain from the notably smooth sweep of the seconds, and it also offers a moderate 40-hour power reserve on a full wind. Attached to the case is a 5-row stainless steel bracelet by way of quick-release spring bars for toolless swaps, a mix of brushing and high polish, and it concludes with a sleek butterfly clasp, which you need to seat in a specific order to properly close. Our next vintage reissue, the Tissot Heritage 1973, is an ode to Tissot's racing heritage and a chronograph of the same design, which debuted during that era. In collaboration with Kessel Classics Formula One racing team, they've reissued this watch with new life and a slightly larger size. It evokes iconic Tissot chronographs of the past like the Navigator, which housed the LeMania caliber, and LeMania themselves have maintained a copious amount of motorsports heritage, but that's for another time. You can check out our guide of the best automotive watches when you're finished here, as that's a great watch for anyone who's into both watches and cars. Unlike the Navigator of old, the new, as of 2020, Tissot Heritage 1973 chronograph adds a third sub-register at the 3 with a dash of blue to break up the black. They did, however, roll over the beautiful tonneau case shape and the stunning radial finish on the top of the case, chamfering quickly to a mirror polish and then a horizontal brushing along the sides. This is a hefty chronograph. On the wrist, you're looking at 43mm in diameter, 46mm lug to lug, and overall 14.8mm thick, and it does sit quite high on the wrist. Take a look. The Heritage 1973 uses the same base Valjoux 7753 as another vintage reissue, the Hamilton Intramatic, but positions its date window at the 4 instead of the 6, and maintains the same 60-hour power reserve. The 7753 offers a central 60 seconds chronograph hand, operated, of course, by the pushers, a 30-minute register, a 60-second register, and a 12-hour at the 6. Flipping the watch over reveals a beautiful view, by the way, with an eye-catching perlage pattern several components deep. A dead giveaway of an automotive-inspired watch is a rally strap. You've seen them before, but perhaps you didn't know it by name. If you're already familiar, no harm, no foul, but it's the name to give any kind of strap that builds in these dots leading up to the lugs. The 22mm brown leather strap here has 4 of them that decrease in size ever so slightly as they extend away from the case. This is also a design cue of the 60s and 70s in general, when the seats of race cars use similar small holes to dissipate heat. All in all, it allows the wrist to breathe just a touch more than your typical unit, and it looks just so damn cool. The 50s and 60s was a happening time for dive watches, which is why the watches from this time, if you can still find them in decent condition, will fetch a pretty penny. The Rado Captain Cook Automatic is one such rare vintage diver that was brought back from the brink within the last 10 years and has seen a few different iterations and styles since. Now technically the 37mm size of this updated Captain Cook is the most true to the original, which used a 37mm case as well, but the overall approach and style of the Captain Cook line as a whole, the more classic, more conservative editions that is, look and feel remarkably similar to the original, diameter aside. So this is the 42mm version that we have here today, and our wearer here sports a wrist dimension of around 8 inches for context. If you are curious about the 37mm version, we have put together an individual video review with our same wearer a while back that you can find in our channel's archive. 48 to 49mm lug to lug and about 12mm thick, accounting for the domed crystal on top. Surrounding the dial is the bezel, Rado using a high-tech ceramic insert with a steel housing, which slopes down to meet the edge of the crystal. Now the dome sapphire is technically finished with an anti-reflective coating. However, in general, the Rado Captain Cooks, the ones we've experienced with darker dials, tend to not have the best legibility in terms of color rendition. The actual background here looks gray or even black in low light. You have to find just the right angle to see its real color, which is a warm metallic brown. The same holds true of Rado's signature rotating metallic purple anchor logo under the 12 that you need to hit with just the right light to see. It's probably due to a mix of the heavy dome of the crystal itself, which certainly distorts around the edges, and the fact that the dial background is glossy, and that certainly picks up some extra reflections. So for the most part, in most situations, expect to wear a gray or off black dial watch. It's actually quite similar to the vintage Tissot PR516-46622, the Roger Moore Live and Let Die watch. It pretty much looks black in most scenarios, then flashes you a brilliant color once you step into the sun. Alright, based on the ETA 2824-2, the 03763-835 is basically the Powermatic 80, as Rado is, like Tissot, under the Swatch umbrella. Practically, it's going to provide you 80 hours of power as its main selling point. Swatch has leaned on this caliber with slightly different mods and decorations from member to member quite heavily. For any vintage-styled watch to come with a convenient 80 hours of power, or well under 3 full days, is just fine by us. Like other divers from this era, the 7-row beads of rice bracelet is the icing on the cake and really eye-catching. But unlike the originals from yesteryear, the new versions come with Rado's Easy Clip system, which allows you a swap without any extra tools. Our next watch and watchmaker are extra special, as Oris is one of the only surviving fully independent Swiss watchmakers with over 100 years of history who produces limited runs of handcrafted mechanical watches. Our next reissue throws it back even further than the dive watch craze of the 50s and the 60s to the late 1930s, in fact, when Oris released the four-handed pilot watch called the Pointer Date. Instead of a GMT function, as you would normally expect of your boilerplate four-hander, this fourth hand keeps track of, yep, you guessed it, the day of the month. And it's also very unique in its presentation. Looking closely, we can see that the actual pointer or red tip of the hand is basically an inverted arrow. The next most obvious build quality of this anniversary edition of the Pointer Date, apart from the unique function, is the full bronze case, minus the stainless steel case back. Proportionally, bronze watches make up a very small subsect of the whole, but its historical use is well documented. Bronze alloys maintain unique advantages over conventional alloys like steel or raw elements like iron, namely a high degree of corrosion resistance by way of its high copper composition, which can create a protective oxide layer over time, aka a patina. Plus, it just looks so damn cool. Paired with the notably Art Deco styling of the Pointer Date's dial, we think it's just a killer combination. In a way, it reminds us a lot of how Seiko used a gold color case with a version of the Alpinist, the SPB 210. The green dial there and the warm case color pairing so well together. Plus, you can already see some patina across the main case and lugs, and even the pin buckle as well. If you're already a fan of, say, brass EDC, an arguably similar alloy, you'll love the way the case character develops and morphs over time with regular handling. Now, on the wrist, we have 40mm even across the case, a lug-to-lug around 48, and a thickness of 11.5. All around, the Pointer Date maintains excellent proportions, and seeing as it's so elegantly put together, it would pair great with a suit as a dress watch, the thickness of the case also allowing the watch to easily slip under a cuff. Under a domed sapphire glass with mineral reserve for the case back, we obviously got hands-on with the green dial version here, but Oris actually offers a bronze case Pointer Date with several other colors of white, light green, burgundy, brown, and blue, to name a few. Inside, power is supplied by way of the automatic Oris caliber 754, offering a 4 Hz beat rate as well as a modest power reserve of 38 hours, winding by way of Oris's signature red-orange rotor. And the leather strap pairing here feels wholly appropriate for the styling of the case and dial, but Oris does manufacture a full bronze 7-row bracelet, but the price will jump about $500 with this option checked, just as a heads up, and of course it will increase the weight significantly. Our very last vintage reissue is the Zenith Chronomaster EP Original, the EP short for El Primero, packing in a Zenith caliber steeped in horological history. This chronograph is modeled after the Zenith A386, a creation that was first introduced all the way back in 1969. This year should ring a bell. Zenith, in competition with a conglomerate of other Swiss horological contemporaries as well as Seiko in Japan, unofficially raced to create the very first automatic chronograph. Now, there's minor debates here and there about who actually achieved the feat first, even though there is evidence for Zenith, but practically, in terms of Zenith alone, the El Primero caliber saw the light of day and has since become an industry icon, and certainly the shining star of the brand. The modern EP Original celebrates this original feat with a near one-to-one replica of the A386, maintaining original proportions, that is a 38mm case, a compact 46mm lug-to-lug, and a 13mm thickness including the high-domed crystal. And under which is the iconic tri-compacts configuration of blue-gray and light-gray gracing the bottom half of the dial, with the speedy tick of the 1/10 of a second bright red chronograph hand whirling overhead. Timing features include hours and minutes in the center, the normal hand set, with small seconds at the 9, the central bright red chronograph hand that we mentioned that makes one full turn in 10 seconds, a 60-minute counter at the 6, and a 60-second counter at the 3. Around the periphery is a decimal scale to keep track of uber-precise timing. We also have an offset date window between the 4 and the 5 markers, and under the Zenith logo type, a value denoting the high beat El Primero inside, which offers a 5 Hz beat rate composed of over 300 components, 311 to be exact. And Zenith provides a beautiful, crisp view through the case back. Zenith's skeleton star rotor offering great visibility of the column wheel chronograph, which is especially engaging when engaging the pushers at 2 and 4 to start, stop, and reset. To put it plainly, the Zenith El Primero is an insane feat of engineering. The EP Original will not run cheap. Right now, the sticker tag rests just a touch below 10 grand, but in terms of value in the larger market, around this price point, what you're paying for the tech you receive as well as the attainment of such incredible history is quite hard to argue with. And last but certainly not least, Zenith pairs this version of the Chronomaster with a beautiful blue nubuck leather strap with white stitched accents near the lugs, terminating with a beefed up pin buckle system. All around, the colors pair perfectly with the scheme present on the dial. There are so many great vintage reissues on the market, all of which we obviously didn't have time to include today. We do hope to revisit this category someday, but until then, drop us a line below with your personal favorite vintage reissues and why. And also be sure to check out our other coverage on highconsumption.com for more great articles, reviews, and watch guides.